Real.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to CEPS. Welcome to this event. My name is Sophia Russak. I am researcher here at CEPS. I'm chair of today's session. And I'm also one of the two rapporteurs that worked on this report. The other one sits over there. This is Nikolai von Ondarza from the SWP. And between us sits our brilliant chair, Calypso Nikolaidis from the EOY. So the three of us very much were holding the pen, let's say, of the report that we're discussing today. But we did so with a lot of input of a brilliant high-level group, of which some, 6, are sitting right here in the first row. And it would not have been possible, of course, without all their input into this work. It would also not have been possible what we did without the help of our partners, which is the Heinrich Böll Foundation and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. And before we're going to tell you more about our work, I'm going to hand over for some words to the director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, Roderick Käferpütz.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you so much, everybody. It's so exciting to be here because this has been such a long labor, and you said it, right? It feels heavy. A lot of work and passion has been going into this. I'm the director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation here in Brussels, and I'm also really happy from my side to welcome you on behalf of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and the Heinrich Böll Foundation. This has been a really important project for us because Europe is facing a lot of crises, and every crisis, of course, deserves to look at it on its own, but it's more difficult to solve crises when the institutions are not necessarily fit for purpose. And I have this old quote, and I know it's a really old-fashioned quote, but I still like it. It's from Jacques Delors. Europe is like a bicycle. If it doesn't keep on moving, if it stands still, the bicycle will fall over. And I think this report makes a fantastic contribution to how can we keep this bicycle moving? How can we make sure there is more democratic accountability, more transparency? How will we make sure there is a more democratic Europe? And what I've really enjoyed about this report is not just that it has these 5 different pathways, but that it has different policy options which have different levels of realistic assessments. And so even what you wanted to do is you could have like a la carte policy menu where you could say, well, I'm going to pick here the low-hanging fruit, and there it might be better to have the pie in the sky, and there the oldie but goldie could work. And so you could really have a constellation of all these different, very relevant policy measures. And I think also what a fantastic time to present this report now. I mean, the debate on the reform of the EU is in full swing. The Franco-German working group has presented its report as well. And as I gathered from you, you will be presenting the report, Nikolai, Sophia, to the Franco-German working group this week as well. So a fantastic opportunity. And so from my side and from on behalf of the Naumann Foundation, the Heinrich Böll Foundation, a big thank you again to Sophia, to Calypso, to Nikolai, to CEPS-SWP, and of course, all the members that participated in making this report possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Roderick. Thanks a lot. Candid words. Yeah, just a little disclaimer maybe, because you mentioned it, the Franco-German group. Indeed, Nikolai and me were actually members of this group, but these groups were running in parallel, yes, but independently from each other. The Franco-German group was mandated by the French and German foreign ministries, and this is a CEPS and SWP initiative, just to clarify things. In the next 90 minutes, or actually now 80 minutes, we are presenting the report to you, obviously, but we try to, make it as lively as possible, and this is why also we ask our colleagues that work with us on the report to also step in and to help us with this. And then we invited somebody that will comment on our report, and his name is Colin Cicluna. I asked him before how to pronounce his name. Did I do it right now? Perfect. And as you know, he's the head of cabinet of Commission Vice President Suica, and she is responsible for demography and democracy. So, thanks. So we are very happy to have you here. Thanks a lot. But before we turn to you, and hear your feedback on our report and our recommendations. But of course, then the next step is, by the way, to engage with you. So, we're looking forward to your comments and your questions, so please keep them ready. Let me just say a few words about the report. So as I said earlier, is that it was based on the input of the high-level group. We came together physically several times in this very room, actually here, for many intense hours of discussions, after which we then drafted the report. And the report went back to the group, and everybody had the chance to comment on it. But that being said, I want to highlight that not every member of this group agreed necessarily with every single recommendation we make. We have also indicated it in the report, as you will see with the little fire icon, those recommendations that were particularly contentious. So the group was composed of 23 people, academics, politicians, diplomats, officials. And the idea was to bring really together as many, perspectives as possible. So these people that we brought together, they don't represent, they come from many different member states, they come from many EU institutions and also different party political backgrounds. So it was not possible, of course, to draft a report where everybody agrees with every single element with such a diverse group. But that was the whole point. We wanted to bring together diverse voices. The mandate was to bolster EU democracy. We can argue that, of course, there has been improvement when it comes to EU democracy, right? I mean, we have a directly elected parliament by now, which has great legislative and budgetary powers, and we have an increasingly accountable commission. We have stronger national parliaments and also even participatory elements on EU level. But of course, there still is the perception that the EU is not democratic enough, right? The debate on how to make the EU more democratic is absolutely not new, but we think that it is more important now, or that it became more topical, and that is for three reasons. The first one is obviously the EP elections, the European Parliament elections that will be coming up next June. The next reason is a multiple crises that the EU went through in the last years that led to something that we call the new democratic deficit. What we mean with this is very heavily executive-steered crisis governance. And then last but very not least, of course, the return of enlargement, where in our discussion and debates, there is a lot of focus on the capacity to act, but of course, we think that the democratic elements are equally important. Our motto, as you see also in the title, is sunshine. And sunshine for us meant, of course, transparency of EU decision-making procedures and personal integrity of those people that work for the institutions, but it is much more. Calypso, would you like to tell us a bit more about the radicality of sunlight?
Well, indeed. Thanks, Sophia. Thanks for everyone to be here. It has been quite a journey, quite an adventure. And I have to say that perhaps the biggest work we put in was to come up with this flyer that you all have in your hands, which has in big letters on the bottom, indeed, the radicality of sunlight. And why did we choose this title in the end? Well, because the EU is a mess. It's so complicated. You know, when you try to teach it, explain it to people, it's complicated. We're never going to simplify the EU. It is what it is. But and of course, when we speak of democracy, we start talking about institutions, we start talking about procedures, regulations, stuff that really, citizens don't necessarily have access to easily. So in some ways, when we want to talk about democracy in Europe, and we're asking what will be the democratic anchor of this new democratic deficit, the fact that most people agree Europe needs to do more. But the more it does, the more it needs to be anchored in democracy. What can it be? And it was clear from our conversation that short of radical change in the institutional equilibrium, etc., we have to come back to the basics. And the basics, at the end of the day, is this idea of you know, the energy from sunlight. After all, that's what transition is all about. So there's an idea that we need in Europe democratic energy. And democratic energy is what you think of if you think about the radicality of sunlight. So indeed, we use this as a shorthand, and often people say, well, okay, you're talking about transparency. Come on, yeah, well, we've been talking about this for a long time. This is what Sophia was just saying. And indeed, transparency is a radical idea. Real transparency as disinfectants, an old but radical idea. Imagine an EU that, thanks to the internet, thanks to people's vigilance, thanks to the mindset, because transparency starts in the mind of all of the agents of the state, but also the citizens of everyone. National parliaments will come back to this, all of the actors. Transparency is the name of the game. This is a transparent bubble. It's not even a bubble anymore because it's so transparent. Puff! So this is what we tried to imagine together, and we'll get into a bit more detail. But the idea is that, yes, the highest standard of transparency, and Carl is here, you know, the ombudsman reports are very, very clear about this. But it's more than that. It's thanks to transparency, accountability, and thanks to accountability, integrity of those who lead, those who are in position of power, and even beyond, of course, empowerment of those who are empowered by sunlight. And empowerment, of course, of the citizen, and it's one of those words everybody uses, but we're trying to say concretely what it means. And empowerment is not just the ordinary citizen. Of course it's the ordinary citizen, but it's also, you know, Colin, and who needs to be empowered when he wants to give a voice to the citizen. So we're talking about a whole system, an ecosystem, you know, of empowerment that ultimately reflects what we can call democratic respect, that we owe democratic respect to each other. Those in power owe democratic respect to the citizens, citizens to each other, and it's not always the case. And if we have democratic respect, I think we can build, and we've kind of tried to explain how and discussed for many wonderful hours how this can happen. And I want to salute here and echo Sophia in saluting the wonderful members of the high-level group. It was just very intense and fascinating conversations, which we try to reflect in the report.
Thanks, Calypso. Maybe you can even say a bit more. I mean, what did we not do? We did not touch so much on the institutional equilibrium of the EU, and we also, although there was not 100% agreement, but we also wanted to not wait for treaty change. Let's put it like this, right?
Yeah, I think who disagrees like that we should not wait for treaty change? Hands up. Oh, nobody disagrees. So we don't need to persuade you that, you know, okay, cool. Everybody's talking about treaty change in town. The name of the game. The AFCO report is like it's coming out like today, or, you know, I mean, drafts, it came out.
It's in AFCO today.
It is in AFCO today. So we've been following all of the other conversations, right? And treaty change is the name of the game. But, and of course we did talk about treaty change. You know, it was not completely the Voldemort of our conversations, but we're kind of in a rush. Needs to happen now. These are not just the next European elections, there are the geopolitical elections. The first elections of the European, they're really in a intense geopolitical setting. And frankly, when we wrote this in the intro to the report, we didn't know what would be happening, you know, in the last 2 weeks. So, so we have a sense of emergency, of democratic emergency, even though it's not the first time we say this, but more than ever. And it's important for all of us to connect in our mind, you know, here's a world at war, and here we're talking about democracy. You know, what's the connection? Maybe this is something that needs to be in the back of our mind. Probably Kant was right, that if, you know, the whole world was democratic, there would be less war. I mean, that's a pretty good assumption. There are strong relationships between the world of war and the world of democracy. But it's clear we are in a rush, we're in emergency. And so much can be done without treaty change. So much can be done without treaty change. If the minds change, if the practices change, democracy is not this big Platonic thing out there. It's the practices of every day. Every person in power, every person minding power, every person wants to engage in how their life is governed. Well, you know, this is what democracy is. And so we indicate very clearly and concretely in the report the few areas where there would need to be treaty change. But we hope that the kind of things we call for, the kind of things that European political parties can be asked to put in their program, and they will implement it, you know, as of next September when they're in the parliament, without treaty change. But people will, some of you might disagree in the room.
I hope so. So that is about why we did what we do, why we did what we did, and how we did it. But let's talk a little bit about the content. Nikolai, would you like to give us a bit of an overview over what we call the 5 pathways?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I think it's probably the biggest challenge to try to find a quick overview about our different ideas and thoughts. We try to put it in this infographic that you should all have at your table, and I think the basic idea was for us really in this diverse group to come up with both a diagnosis where the EU should do more on democracy, but also develop ideas. And as you said in the beginning, we try to stretch different ideas from really sort of low-hanging fruits, ideas we thought that could be, if the political will is there, implemented quite quickly and without treaty change, often only changing political practice. We came up with ideas we categorized as no free lunch. Some of you might know the saying, there is no free lunch, which means there needs to be some energy devoted. This is something you really need to work hard to achieve, but you can do it. And the third category was the pie in the sky, so something that you can dream about, that some or maybe the whole group would find as a really good recommendation, but that would be a more far-stretched idea. And then, of course, we also added some ideas that are oldies but goldies, so have been around in EU circles for quite some time, but we still find valuable. And some we added a fire because they were particularly sort of discussed about controversially in our group. And based on this thinking, we developed 5 pathways which we think could help to really bolster democracy in the EU. And I'm not going to go through each and every recommendation, but rather tell a little bit about our thinking behind them. And the 5 pathways are here on the infographic. And the first is really the highest standards of transparency and integrity. In our point of view, the both of these aspects should come together and are really fundamental aspects for democratic accountability and legitimacy. And here we really thought about what is necessary in the EU in the legislative process, but also wider decision-making to strengthen transparency, to strengthen integrity, and also build up on the current discussions that are there in the wake of Qatargate about integrity in the EU institutions, but also the questions on how we can enter this idea of strengthened effective transparency in the enlargement process, which is really one of the major challenges facing the EU at the moment. The second pathway for us was the question of how to democratize crisis management. We all have seen an EU that has been much more flexible, much more resilient, in many ways more effective in tackling the crises of recent years on COVID, on the war in Ukraine, where we have seen some progress, but on the other hand, the EU in this flexibility also often used instruments that were at the margins of the treaty, Article 122, emergency clauses, sometimes acting outside of the treaty with less parliamentary control, less parliamentary participation. And here we wanted to develop ideas on how to, on the one hand, keep strengthening this resilience and flexibility of the EU, but also strengthen as a basic idea the democratic grounding of these instruments, because after all, they directly affect public goods, directly impact citizens' life, and many of these crisis decisions also have long-lasting implications on EU integration and the functioning of EU institutions. Third pathway for us, clearly to make the most about European elections, to make them more visible, to make them more impactful. There we tackled some maybe of the more age-old questions of European integration on how we can connect better the elections that are happening next year, but also in the long run with citizens' major points, how we can connect better national and European parties together, and how that that can then also have a bigger impact on what is really at stake in European decision making. Fourth pathway for us, really essential idea of this democratic link, the link between national democratic systems and the European political system, and the question on what role can national parliaments play there, both a more strategic dialogue between national parliaments and each other, but also the European Parliament and the European level. And fifthly, our fifth pathway, really the question of empowering EU citizens through participatory democracy. Sophia already said in the beginning, the EU has developed some tools like the European Citizens Initiative, the Conference on the Future of Europe, 2022-2021. But in many of these instruments, we lack visibility and political buy-in of the EU institutions. And here we wanted to think more about how we can actually make better use of the existing instruments, but also how we can reach more farther instruments in the future and can think about more innovative uses of participatory democracy.
Thanks a lot, Nikolai. So now, indeed, it would totally bore you if you would run through all the recommendations, because there are a lot. There are even more than on the infographic, I should say. And also, we would like to bring in, you know, more than our voices here on stage. So let's run through the high-level group members that are here, and we've asked them to pick one recommendation which is particularly important for them, and to briefly present them to us. Carl, could you make a start? Sure. Carl Dolan from the European Ombudsman's Office.
Thank you very much, Sophia. And as you might imagine, I'm very attached to all of the recommendations in the transparency pathway. But at the risk of being disloyal to my current employer, the Ombudsman, and the importance of compliance with Ombudsman recommendations, the recommendation that I would plump for as the most important one is the creation of a pan-European lobby register. And I say that because the major theme of this report, as you've heard, is about empowerment and about giving people a voice. And in my experience, nothing is a greater spur to action than seeing who is currently influencing decisions, who is currently influencing legislation, and that spurs people to mobilize, to provide a counterweight, to say, my voice needs to be heard on this issue too. So this pan-European lobby register, for the first time, would build on what we have in Brussels, the EU Transparency Register, but it would correct some of the deficiencies of that. I think you only have to talk to any consultant in this town for 5 minutes to realize that nobody only lobbies European Commission and the European institutions, but lobbying is essentially a transnational affair. You know, our policies, our decision-making is increasingly European, the lobbying is European, but actually what we have is a hodgepodge of different national and EU transparency registers. So we need to correct that. And I'm glad to say that the Commission is on its way to correcting that. They've done the hard work of finding a justification, a legal basis for a pan-European lobby register in the forthcoming Defence of Democracy package. Unfortunately, in one of those occasional acts of self-harm that the Commission is prone to, it's decided to restrict registration for this to a small group of organizations that, you know, might be seen as a vehicle for foreign influence. But there's an opportunity still to correct that and to create a genuine pan-European public lobby register for all organizations, CSOs, companies, think tanks, etc.
Thanks a lot, Carl. And I'm very curious, of course, to hear Colin's thoughts on this a little bit later. Lolita, could you go next? Lolita Segan, she is the former chair of the European Affairs Committee from the Parliament in Latvia.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I will dwell a little bit about the crisis management and talk about the fact that very often it happens so when there is a crisis and everyone demands efficiency, it's transparency that suffers because we are just prone to forget about it. So basically what we were discussing and what we are recommending is, first of all, to take stock of crisis management mechanisms that have been implemented and to talk about the good and the bad of them. Also from the point of view of transparency. The second thing that we noticed is that in the immediate Brexit referendum aftermath, there was so-called Barnier method that was applied, meaning that national parliaments were consulted in a rather intensive way. So we suggest this is a good practice that should be continued. Also, some of the crisis management mechanisms created actually quite a lot of financial instruments with rather substantial proposed investments. But there seems to be transparency lacking there too. And of course, checks and balances, institutional checks and balances, involvement of European Parliament in crisis management mechanisms. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Karolina, would you like to proceed? Karolina Boronska, professor at the universities of Wrocław and Sorbonne.
Yes, good evening, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Well, two pathways the closest to my heart are number 4 and number 5. In other words, improving the link between parliaments, national parliaments, and Europe, and also bolstering a participatory democracy. So I wanted to pick one recommendation which, in my view, reconnects these two pathways. And I believe that this is added value of our group, that we have not only postulated that the representative democracy should be strengthened and then participatory, but how they could be combined together in the European forum. And therefore, we postulate that we introduce an element of participatory democracy to the parliamentary dimension of EU rotating presidency. That would basically mean that every 6 months, the parliament of the country holding presidency would host genuine citizens' assembly in this country holding presidency. The format could be obviously agreed, but we would imagine that it could count 3 to 5 randomly selected citizens from each member state, plus, crucially, also citizens from candidate countries. The aim of it would be to not only transnationalize the domestic political spaces, but also Europeanize them. This way, each national parliament could become agora, for exchange of views between national MPs who are very much in their own bubbles, but it would also allow MEPs act as an observers. And I really hope, we do all hope, that the European Commission and the European Parliament could take such an idea on board and support it logistically, financially, because that would also obviously benefit the creation of the European public space, transnationalization of thinking about policies, and obviously EU legitimacy, because that would involve talking about EU affairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caro. Yeah, indeed, that recommendation is a nice crossroads of the increasing participatory democracy and national parliaments. Ben, would you like to continue?
Oh.
Ben Krum, professor at the University of Amsterdam.
Yeah, right. Well, the one challenge that I would like to highlight is still the hot potato of the election of the Commission President. The Commission, of course, is the main executive institution of the European Union. Attempts have been made to connect that election more closely to the elections of the European Parliament. European party groups and members of the European Parliament have been pushing for this lead candidate procedure. We have prohibited each other in the high-level working group to use the German expression for this lead candidate procedure. And actually, it's an issue that I think is there, and everyone knows that it hasn't worked particularly well in 2019 when none of the nominated Spitzenkandidaten, the lead candidates was eventually elected. But there is no immediate solution. We didn't come to a consensus in our working group, but I think we suggest 2 interesting ways to think about it. One way is indeed, and that's promoted by the people who are most kind of affiliated to this idea of a lead party system, is still to bring the European Council more closely on board, to have engaged them early on in the nomination procedures within their respective party groups, the heads of state, to make sure that they are genuinely committed to this more party political procedure. The alternative that I have to say I personally favor is to recognize that rather than that really it's key that the Commission has to trust the mandate of both the Parliament and the Member States, and indirectly also from the citizens as having directly elected their Parliament, but also as having given their trust in the Member States governments. And rather than to make this election a kind of push and pull between the 2 institutions, which looks rather nasty in a way, to give them joint responsibility and to institutionalize that in some kind of, well, what we call in the legislative procedure a conciliation committee, which you could call a joint search committee, but in the end, which we proposed to call an electoral college, half of which was already be determined ahead of the elections by the composition, the party political composition of the European Council, but the other half of it would emanate indeed from the European Parliament elections, and jointly they would search for candidates in a constructive and cooperative rather than conflictual manner for a Commission President that really can trust the mandate of the European people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, this also happens to be one of my favorite topics, but a very interesting, contentious, but very interesting aspect in the wider debate on the parliamentarization of the European Union. Simonetta, why don't you continue? Simonetta Cook, she works for the cabinet of the President of the European Council.
Thank you, Sophia. Rather than talking about one of the suggestions we've made, I thought I would actually talk about one of the challenges, or the one challenge that I think is probably the most significant in trying to implement every single one of these suggestions that we have. And that is, and Calypso, you mentioned it, it's actually changing the mindset. Now, I know that perhaps this opinion is very much tainted by 15 years in the European Council and in the Council, but what I have observed there is a certain resistance to change, a certain comfort in the status quo. When I first worked in the Council, I remember we were discussing transparency, injecting more transparency into the decision-making process, and this was seen very much with sort of hesitation, a bit of reticence, sometimes outright rejection. And I think the reasoning was simply that too much transparency would actually hinder the decision-making process. Positions would get too entrenched in the council, and therefore you'd crystallize positions and you wouldn't be able to move forward. And this was sort of repeated almost like a mantra, as the Brussels bubble often is, some sort of echo chamber, without necessarily questioning it. And I think that this has sometimes gone on a bit too long in the institutions, and I think this is a particular challenge, though. We do tend to repeat certain concepts, even if arguably they're outdated. I think in the era of social media and digitalization, the argument that too much transparency in decision-making with the Council doesn't favor negotiations, that's absolutely wrong. People sitting in the European Council room or sitting outside the European Council room are increasingly aware, rather those outside are increasingly aware of what's happening inside the room anyway, and in real time. So I think that argument's already a bit outdated, but rather whether we choose low-hanging fruit or whether we're going to be choosing pies in the skies, I think that one of the things is really to try and shift that status quo and push to think of things perhaps working differently and working better, even if until now they haven't worked in that way within the institutions.
Thank you, Simonetta, for this candid remark and also for picking up our categories. Calypso, you wanted to...
No, I just listening to Ben, well, to everyone. I just wanted to, just to excite you to read a report, one more report. Are you going to really read it? But I just want to flag the fact that it is like a bit like a Monopoly game, or it's like a game, right? Because there are these little icons. And indeed, for us as a group, we early on made the decision that we wouldn't agree on everything, depending on where we come from, our ideas of Europe, as well as our institutions, home institutions. And so in some cases, we resolved, some disagreement with softer wording, improve, so when you find the word improve, rather than impose or full transparency, partial transparency, we're careful. We're realists, not cynical, but we're realists. But sometimes, suddenly you will spot, both in the first pages and then throughout the report, a little fire. And that's when we resolved to put the more radical proposal in there, right? But indicate with the fire that there was some dissent. We played with the ideas of some members of the group writing dissenting, opinions, like in a court, but we thought this would be more fun. So you can kind of read between the lines, and you can hear from Well, you know, when Ben, of course, the question of lead candidate, and we will not say the word that should not be said. It's my joke because I don't have a single student that can write Spitzencandidate or pronounce it in any way, shape, or form, even Germans. So, you know, lead candidate is more democratic. The first thing about mindset, Humanit, is not to use jargon, European words like that. And so, indeed, there were very, very heated discussions in our group. And I think, to be fair, we tried to reflect that in the wording of the alternatives and the proposals in a realistic manner.
And there are quite some fires.
Sorry?
There are quite some fires throughout.
There are a number of fires, so you will be amused to see where they are and to spot them. And sometimes there are even implicit fires that are just in the words. So there you go.
And we still have Paula. Paula Lorente is the last one that will speak as a member from our high-level group. She has been participating as one of the young thinkers. That is a CEPS initiative where we want to bring young voices into the debate about European politics. Paula.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. As different initiatives and different proposals have already been mentioned, I think I'm going to talk about something that's more general and goes directly more to my heart, as you're going to soon know, which is the radicality of sunlight also involves shedding that light and having that light reaching other parts and other groups, in this case, the youth. I believe one of the maybe most important things that we're doing in this debate and that we were having, you're going to be able to read all the recommendations, and I'm sure that you're going to debate a lot about it and talk about them and give them a lot of thought. But one very important thing in the exercise was including young people, because young people can add to the debate. It is part of the democratic game to include us in the conversations and not exclude us or leave us to have young or youth conversations only. We can organize ourselves to have those young conversations, and we can also talk about other topics, but the youth should not be only left to talk about youth topics. So it is up to all of us sitting in this room, and I know it's an exercise that it's starting to gain traction, but I think it's important that we put the light and the focus there as well, that more and more people need to make us and help us make room for us so that we can talk about every single topic, including, of course, bolstering EU democracy.
Bravo, Paula. I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much. And Colin, thank you for being so patient with us and hearing us all out. Now I'm very curious. You, as the head of cabinet of the vice president responsible for democracy, what is your take on the report? What is your take on the recommendations that you maybe have read already and that you heard here?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation and for the possibility to share a few reflections with you all. Actually, by introducing me with my job title, you put me on the spot a little bit, because when I opened up this this wonderful booklet here, one of the things that struck me was that all members took part in a personal capacity, and I was hoping I could claim that as well. But actually, the first thought was when I read the title. And I have to admit that as a quite rather conventional civil servant, the radicality of sunlight sounded to me like a bit of a buzz term, like something that's interesting, but what's there behind it? But the more I read the document, the more I got what it was all about, and especially the combination of light and energy that the sun represents. And introducing the element of radicality. And so my first reflection, the first reflection I want to share, is that whether or not we agree or disagree with the recommendations, it's great that this debate is taking place. And that thoughts like these are being put into the public domain. And it's important. It's important that we have the opportunity to discuss these things, because I think one of the first questions, and I'm sure that you discussed this in preparing the report, is, in Europe today, what is the health of our democracy? And I think when we look at what's happening in our immediate neighborhood, but also in the world at large, we can come to the conclusion that it's not too bad after all in Europe. We've got a pretty good level of democracy, and our institutions, which we criticize a lot, tend to work rather well and deliver results. But the reality, I think, is rather different, because I think that there is a risk of backsliding. I think there is a risk of taking for granted this atmosphere in which we carry out our daily business. And so I think that this radical thought and these radical proposals are something we need desperately, to at least to have the debate. Now, it'll be very difficult to go through all of the things that struck me in this report, so I'll try to pick one or two elements from each of the 5 pathways. Now, transparency and integrity. I'm very glad that the 2 of them are put together. I would actually come to the conclusion, perhaps, that if you do actually have integrity, you don't necessarily need transparency. So I would perhaps value integrity more than transparency, including because I think that that confidential space that was mentioned is something that we also have to protect. I think transparency is extremely important, and it is important that we explain and we take time to explain what we're doing, that we consult, and that we take time to consult with as broad an audience as possible. But I think it is also very important that we define and explain that confidential space. And that ranges from the fact that you might want to discuss ideas that will never make their way to the decision-making process, and you need to have the liberty to do that without the danger of being called out for having certain ideas on the table. But also to the fact that there is sometimes a responsibility to protect, whether it's people or also, let's say, ideas or circumstances. I'm thinking more of people because in a previous life, when I worked on the Middle East, which is now very much in actuality, I would meet human rights defenders from certain states, and I wouldn't want to publicize the fact that I met so-and-so and this person and that group, because that could put those people in danger. Now, this is probably a rather extreme case, and not one that we would encounter every day. But I think it's important to bear in mind the fact that this confidential space is not only something that we civil servants or diplomats like to use as an excuse to keep stuff to ourselves. I think we need to be very careful to defend the openness and to insist on the openness, but we need to also keep that little space available. Integrity itself is very difficult to define. In a way, transparency is maybe easier to define. Integrity is one of those things, like democracy, which we know it when we see it. We can't really, everyone will have their own way of defining it. So I think it's very important that here in this report you are mentioning, you are kind of putting pointers as to where we should be trying to head. In the second pathway on the democratic crisis, to democratize crisis governance, there were 2 things that struck me in particular. One was the Barnier method that was mentioned, and that I think is something we really need to do more, because I think the EU is very complex, and we have very many different layers of governance, many different actors, and it takes time to consult everyone and to inform everyone. But it's important that we build in to our working methods this kind of approach, that we do try to reach as broad an audience as possible, and not just to inform, but also to listen to and to hear from them. And linked to this is something which I think is not restricted to necessarily to this pathway, but goes to a number of aspects mentioned in the document, is the importance of follow-up, the importance of explaining. And this is something that we encountered a lot in the context of the Conference of the Future of Europe, where I think it's very important that we take the time to not only say what we're doing, but to explain why we're doing, and also to explain why we're not doing certain things, because I think we're not necessarily expected to do everything. I think there is an understanding that resources are finite. But we need to give reasons, whether it's because things, some things may be too expensive, some things maybe we don't have the appropriate resources. There may be a number of reasons. But we need competences. We need to take the time to do that. On the third pathway on the European Parliament elections, I mean, I probably as a Commission official shouldn't comment on the European Parliament, but as a citizen, I think that I can and I should. I think we know and we understand, and the document, I think, outlines very, very well some of the drawbacks that still exist, in the sense that very often the Parliament elections campaigns are dominated by local or national issues, for instance, and are rarely about truly European issues. The problems with turnout, which tend to be lower than with other elections. One element that I find interesting as well in this context, and again, this applies to a number of aspects, is the role of political parties. And you do allude to this. But I think there are many, in a way, contradictions sometimes when we look at what the political parties are doing. For instance, when we think of the interinstitutional battles that we love to talk about so much in Brussels, in reality, the politicians involved belong to the same political parties and political families, whether they are a prime minister sitting in the council, or a commissioner sitting in the commission, or a member of the European Parliament. There should be more of a thread running through the work, irrespective of which institution it's taking place in. But in reality, we don't see that much of it. We don't see that consistency running through. I mean, recently, and this is something that was very public, we saw on the nature preservation law in the European Parliament, where the political group to which the President of the Commission and many of her commissioners belong to were at odds on a very fundamental issue. So I think this is something we also need to discuss more. What is the role of political parties today? Are they losing their relevance? Do they have a different relevance today in a different political environment? I think this is a discussion that could be very interesting to go into in more detail. I'll avoid getting into trouble by not talking about lead candidates and transnational lists. Maybe we can come back to that in a bit later. But on the fourth pathway, about the role of national parliaments, there I think there's a lot more that needs to be done as well. I think we do need to find ways for national parliaments, and I would go even further and say regional and local authorities as well. We need to find ways that the different levels of governance come together in a more coherent way in designing and devising policy at the EU level. And one thing that is noted in the document, which I think is extremely important, is the lack of interaction between the European Parliament and national parliaments. This is something I think that is, in fact, we had quite an interesting, I think, example of it, again, during the conference on the future of Europe, where in the beginning there was a kind of, I would say, I know I'm going to get myself into trouble for saying this, but there was a kind of marriage of convenience between the elected representatives, because they felt that having the citizens involved in such a prominent way, in a sense, was in somehow a challenge to representative democracy. And so there was this kind of alliance that was emerging within these two cohorts, which I think as time went on changed and became the more usual kind of relationship that there is between the European Parliament and national parliaments. But I think that this is certainly one area where we can do a great deal. And the last one on citizens' engagement, that's perhaps the one I feel most qualified in a sense to talk about, and there are many, many things to mention here. I take the point about the European Citizens Initiatives, and that I think in reality the short reaction to that is that we need improvements on both sides. We probably need to do more in the Commission in how we deal and we work with the initiatives. But I think on the other side, there's also something to be said about the fact that the Citizens Initiative has, to some extent, I think, been dominated by certain interests, and we tend to have very similar subjects coming up, and it is a little skewed in favor of those who can mobilize support, while the regular citizen in fact, would probably not be able to mobilize that level of support. On citizens' participation, I think the conference was as we've said many times, was unique in the fact that we had the involvement of the citizens, the fact that the three institutions were working together. I sometimes say, only half jokingly, that the best thing about it was the three institutions, and the worst thing about it was that it was the three institutions. But in fact, it was really important that all the three institutions were involved in this very unique exercise. One thing that perhaps I think is not given enough attention is, because we talk a lot about the outcomes of the conference, but we need to also look at the format, I think, to some degree. And there are two things in particular. One was the multilingual nature. And this is something that from a logistical point of view, but also in terms of the output, was extremely important, that everything was done in 24 languages. I think we need to give more credit to that. And secondly was this very unique plenary that we had, where we brought together the elected representatives, ministers, civil society, and representatives from the citizens' panels. And I think that if we're going to try to take citizens' participation to the next level, this is where we need to look to take that next step. Because we need to find a way that the work that's done in citizens' assemblies is really taken on board and debated in a very meaningful way with those who are decision makers. And the plenary was precisely that, a place where proposals from the citizens could be refined, could be enriched within the interaction with the politicians. One last point on this is there was this idea on the countries holding the presidency organizing citizens' panels, citizens' assemblies. I think it's a great idea. I think one way of doing that would perhaps be before presidencies, that you would have panels that contribute to the elaboration of the presidency priorities. And in fact, recently in Spain, you had something similar, because the Spanish government, when they were drawing up their presidency priorities, before presenting them to the EU institutions, they actually consulted with civil society. They brought together representatives of civil society, and the Vice President Suiza was invited to participate at that event. And I think it was very meaningful that you had this interaction on the priorities. The next step could be having assemblies which are discussing these things. Two last very quick points. I liked very much that there was the line, we agree that institutions do matter, but that they are not the core problem as such. And I liked it because this is linked to the debate on treaty change and institutions. This has become too much of an obsession, in my view. I think there are many, many other things we can talk about, many other ways that we can reform the EU and make the EU better without having to change the treaties. Of course, we should and we can have the debate. And if the moment is there to change the treaties, let's do it by all means. But sometimes that becomes an alibi for not doing anything. And there are many, many other things that we can do in the meantime. Last point, the media. I think that is the one thing that's missing in the report. I think there isn't enough about the role that the media can play in shaping public opinion, in shaping the views of decision makers as well in this debate. And I think that perhaps that's something that can be taken a little further in the debates that will follow. I'm sorry if I've been too long, but I'll stop there. Very happy.
No, absolutely not. It was very interesting listening to you. Thank you very much for your points. Yeah, really. You took that role serious as a commentator, and you really dove into the text, and we appreciate that. Right? We took good note of your comments. I would love to talk to you about many things you said, but I won't now, because I see that we're already 1 hour into the event, and I do want to give the chance to you to ask questions. I will look, though, to my two co-authors, whether they would like to comment on something that Colin has said, respond to something short, maybe 1 or 2 minutes.
I will use the opportunity of the questions to come back to.
Yes, let's do it like this indeed. So, who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Yes, please. Can you maybe share your things? Perfect. Thanks.
Many thanks to everyone for this presentation of the report. One thing that it struck me that was not mentioned very much, well, Colin mentioned it a little bit, is the role of civil society and collective actors more broadly, so trade unions and also national political parties beyond national parliaments, the sort of mass membership political parties that in some ways have been hollowed out for the last decade. So what's the role of these actors? Because in my view, they are the only ones that really can mobilize issues in the public sphere through the media. I mean, it's good that we have more transparency, but without actually having more mobilization at the national level on European issues driven by trade unions, by civil society, by political parties, it's hard to bolster, I think, EU democracy. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Alvaro. Alvaro Oleat from the University of Brussels. Please indicate your name and affiliation really briefly. Anybody else? I'm going to collect a little bit. I'm sure there are more questions. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Carol Thomas. I work for the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, and to some extent, obviously, I want to bounce back off on a little bit of what the previous speaker said. But very much picking up Colin's point, which I think I've linked to, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name when you talked about crisis management and how that was done at the subnational level and who was responsible for that, quite clearly linking up this issue about particularly the recovery and resilience facility, the big pot of money that was there, of course, to help us to bounce back from crises. But those who are responsible, of course, for taking forward in an impactful way weren't, obviously, as the point was made, civil society, but particularly local and regional governments haven't been involved in looking at how the plans were prepared, how they were designed. And so the question I have is, Colin, do you see a potential for that change to the involvement of those actors at the subnational level, given that we look as if increasingly we may be moving towards policies because they are viewed to be more impactful if we leave it to the council and national governments to be able to determine and define those big policies, when at the end of the day, the action and the work has to take place at the subnational level, but we're not getting, as you've rightly highlighted, all of those actors involved in that hard graft at the coalface. Thanks.
Yes, please. Could you pass on the microphone?
My question is
Could you introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, I'm Marie Cormand. I'm an ordinary citizen, so nothing more special than that to say. I tried to find how MEPs had voted on an amendment, and I couldn't find the information. So this basic type of information is really very hard to find. In the end, I got a few lists, but I could never understand who voted how, when, and so the basic information is really hard to access. Thank you.
Thank you very much, yes. Should we go, or is there anybody already now, or would you like to think a bit more? Otherwise, yes, please, the gentleman in the first row, and then we go back.
I'm not sure I've understood everything well, but your last comments touch upon the question I have. To what extent the institutions and the functioning of the institution address the democratic deficit or so? I'm just like to point to the fact that our economic and social policies are governed by monetarist thinking decided in the financial institutions. And we have money thinking and everything, primarily. I like the first comment that it's in the family life and the normal life the democratic is started, as well as in the working life. So I was just trying to understand how the issues you are raising here address those things problems.
Colin, would you like to start?
Yes. So on the question of the subnational governance levels first, I think you raise a very valid point. The difficulty that we have, I think, at the European level is that inevitably our first point of contact is with national governments. Now, each member state has different rules, different setups as to how the subnational strata interact in decision making. So you have some which are federal states, you have some which are not, you have some where you have regions that have the ability to pass legislations, others where you don't. So it's very difficult from the European level to identify some interlocutors but not others, which means that we have to depend on each government to organize itself in the way that it thinks it should, especially in crisis situations. And I think the COVID pandemic was a very good example of how these challenges, how unusual challenges in a way, presented themselves. So, for example, the fact that some regions were more badly hit than others, especially early on. You had the distribution of vaccines later on, which in some member states was more complicated than in others. So I think in this kind of situation, I think it would be particularly helpful if we could find ways to, if not, certainly not to avoid the national level, certainly not, but to find ways in which we can be more inclusive in the way that certain policies and certain decisions can be implemented. I think it's especially in the implementation where you have the main challenge. The question of the democratic deficit was raised. Now, sometimes I have to admit, I tend to think that this has become a bit of a buzz phrase, because and very often it's directed at the council and perhaps and also at the commission, of course. But the reality is that the legitimacy of the commission comes first and foremost from the treaty that determines how the commission shall be appointed. And each government that is nominating a member of the commission is itself a legitimately elected government. So if we start talking about the fact that the institutions have deficits of democratic legitimacy, we're actually questioning the basis of that legitimacy as well. So I think we need to be careful that this can become a bit of a slippery slope. Now, I can understand that you may have that there is a trend to want to have more legitimacy, and there's nothing wrong with that. And a number of different formulae have been discussed, have been proposed over time, and I think that many of them have merit. But I think it's also useful to analyze, I think, the actual setups that we have, and to acknowledge that in reality they do have a greater degree of legitimacy than sometimes they're given credit for.
Would you like to step in? Or
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Do you want to push? Or which order should we go? You're the moderator.
Yes, please. Go,
okay.
Nikolai.
Perfect. So thank you very much, Colin, for your comments and the questions. I want to maybe pick out three points of them that I found particularly also resonated with our discussions in the group. And the first one is maybe your point about the relationship between transparency, integrity, and confidential spaces in EU decision making. And I think we really started from the point that for democratic accountability, you need transparency in decision making, especially if you do legislation. And we had many members in our group coming from the institutions, which also made your point that there is the necessity for confidential space in the negotiations itself. But then on the other hand, you need transparency of the process, so the meetings that are taking place, the votes that are taking place, the questions on if there are written amendments on the table. And this is why this idea about when the council acts as a legislative body, it should also work in transparency in the requirement that we expect from a legislative body, that the votes are public, not just the final votes, but the votes on amendment, the amendments themselves. And this is, we know it's a tricky issue, but I think we need to find the balance between where there is political negotiation space that is confidential, because otherwise we know negotiations will just move elsewhere to an even more informal area, but also transparency about the legislative actions that are being taken.
So, sorry to jump in, but this was actually one of the points which kind of piqued my interest.
Yeah.
Because you in the document you make this distinction where you talk about the council operating in its legislative function and in its diplomatic function. And I'm not sure that you can define that distinction, because in most cases it's acting as both simultaneously.
Yeah.
So the question arises, you know, how the council itself isn't going to step out and describe itself as doing one or the other. I say this as having been previously a member state representative. So.
It's definitely a tricky issue, but what we, for instance, take one example where there are votes recently where the council made a decision on the council position for the negotiations on the migration and common European and asylum system package. We know from media reports that some countries were outvoted, but the voting decisions on that are not public. And so the council took a decision on a legislative file, where the council took a decision as a legislative body for the negotiations with the European Parliament, but the votes in the council on that are not public. And so there are some media reports for some countries that are being outvoted. Some countries say themselves that they were outvoted because maybe they want to say to a national audience, here we are, and being outvoted by our other member states in Brussels, but there is no overall transparency on that. And this is where we said, where it acts in a legislative function, there should be an enhancement of transparency, knowing full well that there is a necessity for the confidential spaces. But of course, that's always more tricky in practice than it might be looking on a general position. Second point on the Barnier method. I mean, we have somebody here with Stefan who has been, I don't know if I can say authors, but maybe one of the brains behind the Barnier methods. And I think for me and in our group, discussing that was not only important, there was explaining about the decisions, but also to some extent maybe even a strategic use of transparency. So using transparency to get out in the public space, making the EU's positions there, even publishing slides from seminars and discussions that were there that really helped shape the public debate about this. And this, I think, is something that the EU should do more, especially when it takes these decisions on public goods in crisis moments that are so crucial and affect everyday citizens' life, that there is more the strategic use of transparency that could then also feed into discussions in the media that you mentioned. And maybe the third point about MEPs and votes and how do we find that, and we also had the discussion that transparency is not only about making information available, but also accessible for everybody and understandable for everybody. Sometimes the EU makes use of transparency by publishing everything and nothing is then be found. And everybody who's ever tried as an academic to find information on the EU's homepages knows that sometimes sort of you don't see the tree that you're searching for in all of the woods. And this is why I completely agree with you. Sometimes it's even more important not to make this information accessible, but that it's findable and processed in a way that citizens, but also interested media, can then relate it to the wider public, rather than just hiding it. Hiding is maybe too far, but putting it somewhere out there where it's not accessible to citizens.
Yeah, we call this effective transparency, transparency that works, that is visible. And I just wanted to follow up on Nikolai, reacting to Colin, and thank you also for noticing that, you know, what we say on institutions, and I think it's quite important, because You know, very often these debates on democracy in the EU, I mean, someone will take the position, it's all about the European Parliament having more power. Somebody else will say, well, you know, no, the Commission is the guardian of the public interest, so it should be the Commission to become a real government. Let's call it that too. And it's so like, you take sides. I mean, these days with the Middle East, you know, everybody's asked to take sides. So we really decided as a group. Didn't mean that, you know, individual members of the group might have had a position one way or another, but as a group, we decided that the current institutional equilibrium was more or less okay. I mean, it's not for nothing that it is where we are. It makes sense. And the system makes sense. It's complex, but it's kind of, it has to be like that in some ways. But at the same time, we note, and so when you then, Colin, go on to say, well, but after all, it's all made up of governments who are elected, so we call this indirect legitimacy. But we also all know that what we call in the jargon, you know, chains of accountability are too long. The citizens doesn't see between the moment when they chose an MP, generally, which then leads to government, which then leads to sitting in the council, which then leads to a common position, but you don't really know, for the reasons that Nikolai just said, what your government did. It's too long between you, the citizen, and at the end of the day, what is being done. That's this. So the whole theory of indirect legitimacy, and it's true for Europe, it's true for the world, is a problem. That's why we thought you just got to come back to the basics. You can't do anything about that. It's always going to be like this. You can't change it. That's the way the EU works. That's the way the world works. So that's why this very basic thing, and all of these recommendations, many of them, I mean, we kind of laughingly called it oldies but goldies, and we spent a lot of time thinking about the icons. Should it be an old grandma, you know, or should it be, Sophia and I are like, yeah, this icon. Okay, but oldie but goldies, there's stuff that have been around forever, like how transparent should be the trilogues. Well, that's less old than others, you know, but May 9th as a day of elections, you know, we didn't mention it, for the European Parliament. Wouldn't it be cool, you know, if everybody voted on the same day? That would kind of create an incentive to talk about transnational issue and not just national issues in the guise of European elections, you know, and that's an oldie but goldie. And yeah, sure, we were not trying to be original and everything. So it's deceptive that it's all these small, some more or less small. Frankly, I mean, Carl didn't want to go that far, but I mean, didn't want to support the one recommendation that says implement 100% of the ombudsman recommendation. That is normal. And right now, the EU only implements 80%, and the 20 harder are not implemented. That's a recommendation that's really, really close to my heart. And you could say, well, it's an oldie but goldie because, well, you know, we've been asking for this for a long time, but it's super important. Not always super sexy, you know, as sexy as saying we want full power to the European Parliament. So that's, you know, one point. The second point is just to back Nikolai on integrity and transparency. That may be the thing that I kind of disagreed, the way you framed it, Colin. You said, well, if you really have integrity, you don't really need transparency. You might not quite as much need transparency. Something like this, because after all, this politician has integrity. But transparent, but even more, if someone has integrity, then Machiavelli said this very well. You know, if the prince has integrity, then let him or her, you know, show what they do to the people and let the people be part of the story. And that then allows the people to help the prince, the civil servants. See, I've called you a prince now. You should be happy. And that means that. So for instance, one of our recommendations, and I think Lolita picked it up, you know, full transparency of instruments. So, you know, maybe you have a commissioner with a lot of integrity that oversees the Next Gen Fund or the regional funds. Lots of integrity. So the politicians, but then what do we really know? You know, the local market, you know, you give EU taxpayer money to buy solar panels for, you know, 300 kilometers of solar panels. Well, full transparency makes the ordinary citizen, the young person, Laura's young person in a basement, a hacker, you know, is like, oh, here's how the money is distributed, and an ally to the civil servant. And they all have integrity, but the transparency creates a space where they can all work together against corruption, nepotism, etc. And not only in the south of Italy, more or less sorry, I shouldn't say this, I live in Italy, but everywhere in Europe. So that the point is the function of transparency is it's not this meek thing, and we're trying to say this is revolutionary if you have full transparency on how you spend the money. And this leads me to your point about the media, because in a way we implicitly talk about the media, and probably we should have had more space for the media, but we do, for instance, talk about the media helping on transparency of funding of the funds, like Follow the Money and others. So that's important. And that leads me to Alvaro's question on, and linked to the municipality. I mean, of course, Pathway 5, participatory democracy, on is very much about empowering civil society in many different ways, including Carolina, spoke about the very important proposal on the and Colin picked it up on national parliaments having citizen assemblies or borrowing from a standing assembly. Indeed, picking up the proposal on a standing European citizens assembly, where, of course, civil society has a role, but you then find it, of course, in the question of the register. Of course, this is also about creating a level playing field for civil society, transparency of funds, transparency of trilogues, because then civil society can intervene much more than, the lobbies intervene already, the other lobbies. I shouldn't say the good lobbies and the bad lobbies, but whatever. So actually, and perhaps I would say that in the report we probably should have been more explicit about who disempowers and who, so next report, part 2. But it's there everywhere, because that's what democracy is about.
Colin, I believe you want to step in.
I just want to clarify, because I don't want anyone to go away from here thinking that I'm not in favor of transparency. The point I was trying to make was that, I think there is a lot we can do to increase transparency and to improve transparency. But in reality, I think that, and this comes to what was mentioned before about changing mindsets, that, I think there's a lot we need to do on the question of integrity and on what integrity means and what ethics actually mean. Because very often, if you need to consult whether something is ethical or not, then you're already, you shouldn't even get to that point. You should know, you should have an instinct that's honed sufficiently to be able to take the right choices. Now, I know this is very idealistic, in practice it's more difficult. But what I meant was that if you have a system where integrity is guaranteed at all levels, then you're already very far along the path to ensuring that things are going to be done in the right way. So then the question of openness, of transparency, takes on a different weight. So I just wanted to be entirely clear.
Colin, I know you said you don't want to talk about the lead candidate procedure, but you also were talking about party politics and how parties can be a threat running through the different institutions. And while not everybody would agree, and not everybody thinks that this kind of politicization, party politicization of European politics is something desirable, I agree with you. I think it can bridge between interinstitutional conflicts. One of them is how to appoint a Commission president, the conflict between the European Parliament and the European Council. Now, at the beginning of this mandate, this Commission mandate, President von der Leyen, she was quite outspoken and said that she's basically, I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to solve this in my term. What is the status on this? It seemed to us observers that throughout the term, after she made that pledge to the European Parliament, that she lost interest. Can you tell us a little bit what the Commission thinking is, if there's any efforts in kind of, mediating between the institutions and finding a solution?
Thank you very much for that.
Oops.
No, look, I think the Commission itself is in a very difficult position on this particular question, because in a sense, we should actually step away from it and let those who take the decisions decide about how this should be we are run by the outcome of that decision. So in a sense, if we step in and become part of the debate, there's even a question of conflict of interest, potentially, especially when you have, let's say, in a hypothetical situation of a president of the commission who wishes to stand for a second term, for instance. So I think, clearly we still have a system where, according to the treaties, other institutions have clear roles to play in this. I do think that it would be helpful, more generally, if there was a clearer path towards the way in which a president of the commission is selected. And in a sense, I think it's quite positive that so much more attention is given to this. I think in the past, nobody really knew about, whether it's going to be this or that president of the commission, save for a few people who are directly involved. This has become now something that is actually quite well known, and not just in the Brussels bubble. I think beyond that. So, yeah, I think having the president of the commission resolving the question of whether or not there would be a lead candidate is actually perhaps expecting more than one should.
But she had promised it. But I like your diplomatic answer. No, I'm not going to push you further on that. Thanks a lot. Looking at the time, we have 2 minutes left. Is there anything that Nikolai or Calypso would like to?
And I wanted to ask if people in the room, I mean, also those who've been invoked, Ingrid, Stefan, but also our colleagues here in the first row.
Absolutely.
Had stuff to add. So.
Exactly. I'm looking at the first row here. Are there any more thoughts
Ingrid,
that you would like to share?
You want to add something?
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Ingrid Godkin. I work in the cabinet of the Vice President for Democracy and Demography. And in the interest of all transparency, Colin is my boss. So I just wanted to make that clear. And on our way over here, actually, we were discussing about this concept about the radicality of sunlight that comes out of your report. And we both had a different approach to it, even if we did have a shared appreciation. I like this renewal character of sunlight. We have dawn following dusk, following dawn, following dusk. And I think this is really something that you've captured in the report. Also the fact that sunlight also shines a light into those areas that are looking for light. It shows where there are cracks, and where there are cracks, there are opportunities. And I think you've managed to show that in your report as well. I find that democracy itself lends itself very much to this kind of metaphor, because democracy itself contains the seeds of renewal. And I think in that context, citizens themselves are some of our best allies in that, actually. And that's why I was thinking also about, deliberation, of course, and citizen participation, but also, most importantly, from an intergenerational point of view. And sunlight also inspired that, because then I was thinking about, grandparents, parents, young people, children coming together either around the dinner table or in a picnic in the sun, and they're talking about the issues that concern them the most. Energy crisis, climate change. This is something that every member of every family can discuss, and I think this is something that is really important. And I think when it comes to shining light on that, I think that your report is helping to do that. And I think this whole idea of the intergenerational discussion across democracy is itself very important. And also for us coming from this democracy and demography point of view, I could go on for hours about longevity literacy, but I won't get into that now. We'll do that another time, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. I mean, these were really the perfect final words. Thanks for your metaphorical support in these last minutes. Unless our chair wants to add something. You have the last word, Calypso. Would you like to?
I don't want to have the last word, but I'm really happy you ended on literacy, because we do say in the report in several places that all of the democratic mindset and practice is about everywhere. It's in where you work, it's your schools, it's at home. And of course, it's in parliaments and in the state, etc. And so one of the proposals that hasn't percolated, but is so important, is the idea that the institutions should encourage a broad debate on how democracy is taught in schools, in primary schools. We're not talking about high school. How democracy is practiced by kids. You're a 7-year-old kid, and you have to decide whether your food kitchen goes vegan or not. And well, the kids will discuss it democratically and learn something also about the EU. So that's the practice of democracy everywhere. It's back to the question of civil society is so important. And I love the fact that you imagine doing this, on a picnic or wherever it is. So perhaps that's the very good word for everybody, that we're doing democracy everywhere, anywhere, and all the time. That's the dream.
And I love how you squeezed in another one of our recommendations. Very elegant. So thank you, Colin, very much for coming and taking the time and commenting. Thank you, Nikolai, for this wonderful cooperation. Thank you, Calypso, for being really a brilliant chair. And thanks to the group for all your time and valuable input. And thanks to you for coming here and listening. Bye-bye.
And you can download the report. Just so you know, I think we have more of these sheets, the one-pager.
Yeah.
But the report is on the CEPS webpage.
Yeah.
And you can download the 440 pages, and we expect that you will have read the 440 pages by tomorrow.